There are natural guys right now, today, who look better and are much larger than most silver-era bodybuilders. So instead of arguing about it, let's actually compare the numbers. That comment appeared under the previous video and picked up 30 likes within the first hour. The person who wrote it was right to push for data over debate. But compare the numbers actually requires having the numbers in front of you, verified, sourced, placed side by side. Not the mythology that accumulates around men like John Grimek and Steve Reeves over 80 years. And not the unverified claims that circulate about modern naturals either. That's what this video does. 4 specific matchups. Grimek, Reeves, and Leroy Colbert on one side. The best documented modern naturals on the other. FFMI is the primary metric. Arm circumference, chest, and waist run underneath it as the tactile layer. The verdict gets delivered, not hedged. But there's also a finding buried in the data that no commenter has yet named explicitly, and it reorients the entire comparison. We'll get there. First, one paragraph of backstory, because the comments demand it, and because getting it wrong would cost us the audience's trust before the first number lands. The previous video surfaced a 1943 letter by John Grimek, referencing his interest in methyl testosterone. 2 camps formed immediately. One camp, 325 likes on that comment, reads the letter as evidence of curiosity before confirmed use. Grimek's competitive peak ran from 1940 to 1941. If he was only researching testosterone in 1943, his titles predate documented access. The other camp reads the letter as proof that testosterone was circulating among elite bodybuilders earlier than the standard narrative assumes. Both readings hold up against what's actually documented. Eric Helms, in his 2014 literature review published in Alan Aragon's Research Review, established that the first corroborated testosterone use in American bodybuilding came in 1954, when Dr. John Ziegler began injecting a small group at York Barbell, including Grimek himself, Jim Park, and featherweight champion Yaz Kuzahara. Before that, testosterone's cost alone was prohibitive. Manufacturing 1 gram in 1940 ran approximately $50, the equivalent of roughly $850 in 2014 dollars. Even someone with a contact at an experimental drug lab willing to break protocols would have been looking at costs that made sustained use nearly impossible for a working-class athlete. Dianabol, the first widely distributed anabolic steroid in the bodybuilding community, arrived in 1958, when Grimek was 48 years old and his competitive career was already a decade in the past. The letter shows awareness. Whether it reflected more than that, no available source can confirm. This video isn't relitigating that question. It's asking whether the physiques themselves sit within natural limits. Now for the metric itself. FFMI, Fat-Free Mass Index, is your lean body mass in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. It's BMI, but calculated on muscle and bone, not total weight. The higher the number, the more muscle relative to frame size. The standard reference for natural limits comes from Corey and colleagues, published in 1995 in the Clinical Journal of Sport Medicine. Their sample of 74 drug-free athletes was drawn from gymnasiums in the Boston and Los Angeles areas. The only requirements were being at least 16 years old and having trained for at least 2 years. The researchers themselves reasoned that athletes recruited from gymnasiums under those criteria couldn't reflect what is maximally possible for genetically gifted, experienced bodybuilders without drugs. In that sample, after applying a post-hoc normalization, no non-user exceeded a normalized FFMI of 25.0. That produced the widely cited claim that 25 is the natural ceiling. But Corey's own historical analysis told a different story. The researchers calculated the FFMI of pre-steroid era Mr. America winners from 1939 to 1959 and arrived at an average of 25.4, above their stated ceiling, with the highest value in that historical dataset reaching 28.0. Helms, reviewing this research in his 2014 AARR article, identified the core limitation. The gym-goer sample couldn't establish the upper boundary of natural human potential. Their own historical analysis from the pre-steroid era confirmed it, indicating, in Helms's own words, that among the most talented and experienced, a higher limit than 25 existed. One critical caveat to carry through everything that follows. A 2 to 3 percentage point error in estimated body fat shifts FFMI by approximately 1 full point. When comparisons sit within 1 to 2 FFMI points of each other, that margin isn't cosmetic. It's the entire argument. Before the modern naturals enter the scoreboard, the selection criteria need to be stated explicitly, because this audience will call it out if they're not. The strongest verification standard in natural bodybuilding is WADA certified drug testing. The INBA and PNBA require all athletes to pass WADA certified urine or blood tests with both in-competition and random out-of-competition testing applied. Published competition results carry a final results pending WADA testing notation for exactly this reason. The WNBF runs WADA-compliant testing and layers on top of it a polygraph verification requiring confirmation of at least a 5-year drug-free period, making it, in their own words, the only way to certify that an athlete has been drug-free for a duration beyond what a urine test can establish. These are the federations where the scientific standard means something. Athletes who compete under those conditions have put their body composition data through an accountability process that silver-era athletes never faced, for the simple reason that no such process existed. The most credible data point on the modern natural side of this comparison comes from a 2024 study by Gonzalez-Cano and colleagues, published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. The study examined 11 male natural physique athletes, 6 PRO, 5 amateur, competing in WNBF competition under WADA testing conditions, with comprehensive anthropometric evaluations conducted within a 24-hour window of their competition. PRO natural physique athletes averaged a BMI of 25.52 on competition day. Amateur competitors averaged 24.45. 2 male competitors cleared the 25.0 FFMI threshold entirely, with the highest documented at 25.73. That finding from a peer-reviewed study of drug-tested athletes on competition day is worth letting settle before moving to the silver era side. The athlete the comment section named by name, Alex Leonidas, known as Alpha Destiny, requires a different kind of transparency. His natural status is self-claimed. He hasn't, as of the research available here, competed in a WADA-tested federation like the INBA or WNBF. His 2023 competition appearance was in an open classic physique category, not a drug-tested event. Community members in that context described him as a true lifetime natty, which is a characterization, not a verification. His height varies across multiple documented sources. One fitness profile aggregator lists him at 165 centimeters, meaning 5 feet 5 inches. Community discussions place him at 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 7 inches. His competition weight has appeared variously as 160 pounds on one platform profile and 185 pounds on a separate Instagram post documenting a physique update. His claimed body fat of 12% is disputed by critics, who estimate 15 to 17% based on gym footage. When you run those inputs through an FFMI calculation at their most favorable configuration, 185 pounds, 5 feet 5 inches, 12% body fat, you get an FFMI approaching 27. At the conservative end, 160 pounds, 5 feet 6 inches, 15% body fat, you get roughly 22.5. A 5-point spread from the same athlete's available data. That range tells you more about the uncertainty than about the man. His documented measurements from a publicly available gym profile: arms 16 inches, chest 46 inches, waist 29 inches, weight 160 pounds. He's in this comparison because the audience named him, and the numbers should be visible. He's not the anchor for the modern naturals case. The WNBF competition data is. Jeff Nippard provides the more defensible middle reference point. He competes in natural bodybuilding contexts, is publicly transparent about his training and body composition, and carries a documented FFMI range of 24.0 to 25.4, depending on measurement timing and normalization method. His physique has been documented consistently enough across multiple points in time that the range is stable. With the selection criteria on the table, the matchups begin. John Grimek. John Carroll Grimek was born in June 1910 in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, the son of Slovak immigrants. The early biographical record paints a picture of someone who discovered physical development almost by accident. He was posing for art classes at Princeton University and the University of Illinois in the early Depression years, earning $80 a week for 80 to 100 hours of work as an artist's model, before York Barbell's Bob Hoffman recognized what was standing in front of him. By the mid-1930s, Grimek had moved to York, Pennsylvania, and was training under Hoffman's system. He represented the United States at the 1936 Berlin Olympics as a weightlifter, finishing 9th in the heavyweight division. He wasn't there as a bodybuilder. He was there as a competitive athlete who happened to carry one of the most developed physiques in the world. At the 1940 AAU Mr. America contest, Grimek won. He won again in 1941. The margin of his dominance was significant enough that AAU officials introduced a rule preventing past winners from re-entering, explicitly designed to give other competitors a chance at the title. Grimek responded to having his category closed by competing in a different one. He won Mr. Universe in 1948, defeating Steve Reeves by what Joe Weider later described as a decisive margin, and won the AAU Mr. USA in 1949 against a field that included Reeves, Clarence Ross, George Eiferman, and Armand Tanny. He retired from competition without a loss on his record. Weider, writing later in Iron Game history, described watching Grimek win the 1948 Mr. Universe through the eyes of a young Reg Park, who had traveled to London specifically to see the competition. John Grimek had a body and the ability to display it that was beyond that of any other man in history up to that point. Park was so affected by what he saw that he immediately renewed his training commitment. Barton Horvath, interviewing Reg Park for Joe Weider on Park's first trip to the United States in 1950, captured what the encounter with a Grimek-era physique felt like in the flesh. Watching Park, not Grimek, but the vocabulary applies. His trapezius development was absolutely the most massive I had ever seen. Upper arms that swell the tape to well over 18 inches. And all this tapering down to a perfectly muscled 31-inch waist. That physical profile, dense mass above, narrow structure below, was the defining visual signature of Silver-era bodybuilding, and Grimek had defined it first. Terry Todd, who worked alongside Grimek at York Barbell in the mid-1960s, encountered him at the age of 53 and documented the experience directly. What struck Todd wasn't that Grimek still looked good for his age. It was that he was genuinely thick in a way that defied the usual logic of older athletes retaining their prime. Todd wrote, "When I reached around him to secure a grip, I was barely able to clasp my hands." He was attempting to help Grimek with a back adjustment in the office, and the circumference of Grimek's thorax, not his arms, his thorax, stopped Todd's hands from meeting. Grimek was continuing to squat over 400 pounds for repetitions in his late 60s. He died in York, Pennsylvania in November 1998 at the age of 88. The measurement record? Wikipedia lists his best statistics as height 5 feet 8.5 inches and career weight 195 pounds. Published measurement records, citing documentation from the era, give his arms at 17.5 inches, his chest at 47 inches, and his waist at 31 inches. All cold measurements, meaning taken without prior pumping. His peak competition weight appears at approximately 210 to 221 pounds across multiple sources, with the 221-pound figure appearing in context from 1941. His strength records, documented separately, included a deadlift of 600 pounds, a squat of 700 pounds, a bench press of 480 pounds, and an overhead press of 364 pounds, numbers that reflect why Hoffman insisted muscles were meant to be useful as well as visible. The FFMI calculation requires stating precisely what's known versus estimated. At his Wikipedia-documented career weight of 195 pounds and height of 5 feet 8.5 inches, with a competitive body fat estimate in the 8 to 12% range, estimates derived from photographs because no objective measurement technology existed, his fat-free mass calculates to approximately 172 to 179 pounds, placing his FFMI between 25.6 and 26.6. Secondary analytical sources have run calculations using his heavier competition weights and arrived at values ranging from 26.9 to 31.9. The upper figure of 31.9 requires both his 1941 peak weight of 221 pounds and an 8% body fat assumption attached to it, inputs that may be accurate or may be generous. The Iron Magazine Maximum Muscular Table from 2007 placed Grimek's lean body mass at approximately 203 pounds. Using his heavier documented competition weights alongside that lean mass figure implies a body fat percentage in the mid to upper teens at those weights, which would pull the FFMI estimate down toward the 26 to 27 range rather than above it. The defensible central estimate for Grimek is between 26 and 28 FFMI. The exact number isn't knowable from available evidence. What can be said without qualification, his chest-to-waist differential of 16 inches, a 47-inch chest against a 31-inch waist, was produced by a man weighing approximately 195 pounds at 5 feet 8.5 inches. His arm circumference of 17.5 inches was documented cold, and the accounts of people who saw him in person consistently use language that suggests the photographs didn't do him justice, not the reverse. Against the modern naturals, Grimek's conservative FFMI estimate of 26 sits roughly 0.3 points above the study's documented individual peak of 25.73. On arm circumference, Grimek's documented 17.5 inches is directly comparable to, but at a different height and body weight context than, modern competition figures. A 5 feet 8.5 inch man with 17.5 inch cold arms represents different proportional development than a shorter, lighter man with similar numbers. On the FFMI metric, where height is already factored into the calculation, Grimek's central estimate exceeds the tested modern competition peak by a margin that sits within the body fat estimation error range. The data doesn't clearly separate them. It suggests Grimek's upper range genuinely exceeds what modern tested naturals have documented, but the uncertainty at both ends of that calculation means a definitive gap can't be stated with confidence. Steve Reeves. Steve Reeves won Mr. America in 1947, the year that the new rule barring repeat winners opened the title to other competitors. He was 21 years old. He won Mr. World in 1948. He lost to Grimek at that year's Mr. Universe and again at the 1949 AAU Mr. USA. Then, in 1950, having spent 7 weeks specifically preparing at the York Barbell Club, he won the NABA Mr. Universe in London. That contest result mattered, but what mattered more was what came next. Reeves appeared in a series of Italian mythological films beginning in the late 1950s, playing Hercules and later Goliath, and those films distributed the visual template of his physique to audiences who had never entered a gymnasium and would never have stumbled across a bodybuilding magazine. For the majority of the Western world through the 1950s, Steve Reeves wasn't one of many bodybuilders. He was the only one they had seen. He became, as multiple period sources document, the standard for U.S. masculinity in that decade, an archetype absorbed into popular culture through movie screens rather than through competition judging. Weider himself noted the peculiar commercial irony of Reeves' film success. The physique that Grimek had clearly dominated in direct competition became more famous than the man who had defeated it because the film audience was vastly larger than the bodybuilding audience. His measurements, per the official Steve Reeves website, were self-reported and taken cold. The site explicitly states the measurements were recorded without being pumped before the measurement. Height, 6 feet 1 inch. Weight, 215 pounds. Arms, 18.5 inches. Calves, 18.5 inches. Neck, 18.5 inches. Thighs, 27 inches. Chest, 54 inches. Waist, 30 inches. The numerical symmetry of his upper measurements, arms, calves, and neck all listed at 18.5 inches, was intentional and became part of his brand. He had a formula for proportionality that he applied as a design principle. A separate phone interview documented by Tony DeFrancisco gives the arm figure as 19 inches rather than 18.5, the waist as 29 rather than 30, and confirms the 54-inch chest. A published magazine article from the period records arms at 18.25 inches and chest at 52 inches. 3 primary sources, 3 slightly different numbers for the same measurements taken at different times by different methods. The waist figure is the most consistent across all versions, 29 to 30 inches, producing a chest-to-waist differential that approached 24 inches regardless of which chest figure you use. Pope and colleagues worked directly with Reeves in the research that produced the Adonis complex. The book explicitly notes Steve Reeves, who kindly provided his photograph for our book. We measured each man's height, weight, and body fat. Those direct measurements aren't fully reproduced in available source excerpts, but the book's stated position that an FFMI of 25 to 26 represents the upper limit for natural athletes came from researchers who had just handled the data from what may have been the most famous natural physique in history. The implication is that Reeves himself sat within or near that range, not far above it. At 6 feet 1 inch, 215 pounds, and a competition-conditioned body fat estimated at 6 to 7%, the standard working assumption for a man competing at his level and era, his FFMI calculates to approximately 25.8 to 26.8. Source versions using 6 feet 2 inches and 235 pounds push the estimate toward 27.9. The self-stated height and weight are the most primary sourced available, so 25.8 to 26.8 is the working range. The comparison with the modern tested naturals at this level becomes genuinely precise. The 2024 WNBF study documented an individual competitor at 25.73 FFMI under drug testing conditions. Jeff Nippard's upper documented FFMI is 25.4. Reeves' conservative lower estimate is 25.8. These 3 figures, 25.4, 25.73, and 25.8, sit within 0.4 FFMI points of each other. A 0.4 point gap is entirely within the 1 point shift that a 2 to 3% body fat estimation error generates. The conservative reading of Steve Reeves' FFMI and the documented peak of modern WADA-tested natural competition are operating within the same measurement territory. That's not a statement that they're identical. Reeves' central estimate of roughly 26.3 sits above both modern reference points, but the separation isn't large enough to be conclusive when the silver-era body fat figure is derived from photographs and the modern figure comes from direct anthropometric measurement. If anything, the modern figure benefits from the more rigorous measurement methodology. On secondary measurements, the picture is different. Reeves' cold arms at 18.5 to 19 inches sit above what most modern tested naturals document at stage weight. His chest, whether the 52-inch or 54-inch figure, significantly exceeds modern competition standards for men of comparable lean mass. Some portion of that chest measurement reflects the specific breathing, squat, and pullover protocols that silver-era athletes used to expand rib cage diameter, a structural effect on thoracic capacity rather than muscular development of the pectorals specifically, which makes cross-era chest comparison less analytically clean than arm or FFMI comparisons. His waist of 29 to 30 inches is consistent with modern competition conditioning. His thighs at 27 inches cold were proportionally balanced to his upper body in a way that the camera translated into a readable aesthetic logic. On the Reeves matchup, this is the closest comparison between the silver-era individual and modern tested naturals. The FFMI gap is real, but small enough that it can't be definitively separated from measurement methodology differences. The arm circumference advantage favors Reeves. The chest advantage favors Reeves. The waist is comparable. At the aggregate level, Reeves' physique sits at or just above the upper boundary of what the tested modern natural distribution has documented, depending on which of his conflicting measurement figures you accept. Leroy Colbert. Leroy Colbert's name appears less often than Grimek's or Reeves in these comparisons, and that absence is worth correcting with the actual record. Colbert was born in May 1933, grew up in New York, and entered the physical culture world in an era when having 18-inch arms at any age was considered exceptional. He did it at 18. The April 1951 issue of Your Physique magazine documented exactly that, and the record has been consistent ever since. 18-inch arms at 18 years old. By the early 1950s, he had pushed beyond that. Physical culture documentation from the period, cross-referenced through multiple sources, credits him with becoming the first man on record to develop 20-inch arms, a milestone that came with the specificity of documented sources behind it, not just community lore. He stood 5 feet 8 inches and weighed 205 pounds at his documented peak. His published measurements? Arms, 19 inches cold. Chest, 49 inches. Waist, 34 inches. Thighs, 26 inches. The 19-inch cold arm figure deserves a moment of context. Cold measurements in the Silver Era standard meant no pump, no blood volume driven into the tissue by prior exercise. The number came from the tape measure applied to a resting limb. Modern competition arm measurements, when they appear, are typically taken in similar conditions for consistency. The 19-inch figure isn't a pumped vanity measurement. It's the baseline, which makes the achievement more straightforward to compare. His waist at 34 inches is the widest of the 3 Silver Era athletes in this comparison, larger than Grimek's 31 inches and Reeves' 29 to 30 inches. That's a different structural proportion. Colbert built his physique around extreme arm and upper body development relative to his height and weight, with a less severe waist-to-chest differential than Reeves achieved. 2 different aesthetic approaches to the same weight class and era. No FFMI figure has been published for Colbert. The derivation from available data. At 205 pounds, 5 feet 8 inches, 172 centimeters, with a body fat estimate in the 9 to 10% range for competitive prime condition, his fat-free mass calculates to approximately 184 to 187 pounds, or roughly 83.5 to 84.8 kilograms. Dividing by height squared, 1.727 squared equals 2.982, yields an estimated FFMI in the range of 28.0 to 28.4. That's a derived estimate carrying the same body fat uncertainty that runs through every historical calculation in this video. It isn't a published figure, but it's consistent with where his documented weight, height, and arm measurements place him relative to Grimek and Reeves, and it's the honest calculation the available data supports. The specific comparison with Alpha Destiny is direct on arm circumference. Alpha Destiny's documented arms are 16 inches at approximately 160 pounds, and 5 feet 5 inches to 5 feet 6 inches in height. Colbert's documented arms were 19 inches cold at 205 pounds and 5 feet 8 inches, first reached by the magazine record at the age of 18. That's a 3-inch gap at different heights and different body weights, with Colbert's advantage in both absolute measurement and proportional context. At the FFMI level, if Colbert's derived estimate sits around 28 and Alpha Destiny's most favorable calculation approaches 27, the gap is smaller. But Alpha Destiny's favorable inputs require accepting his self-claimed 12% body fat, which is disputed, and his 185-pound body weight, which appears on an Instagram post rather than a competition day weigh-in. The 2024 WNBF tested competition peak of 25.73 sits approximately 2.5 to 2.7 points below the Colbert FFMI derivation at the conservative end. On this individual matchup, the Silver Era holds the advantage, with the caveat stated clearly that Colbert's FFMI is an estimate from a calculation, not a published figure, and his body fat percentage is an assumption. The group comparison. This is the matchup with the clearest data on both sides, because both columns carry FFMI figures from peer-reviewed academic work rather than individual estimates. The Corey 1995 study calculated that the pre-steroid era Mr. America winners from 1939 to 1959 averaged a normalized FFMI of 25.4, with the highest recorded value at 28.0. Helms, applying greater historical skepticism in his 2014 AARR article, broke this into finer time windows. The 1939 to 1944 winners, an era where, in his words, drug use can be excluded with near certainty, averaged FFMI 24.9, with the highest at 27.3. That 27.3 belonged to Steve Stanko in 1944, a man who stood 5 feet 11.5 inches and reportedly weighed 223 pounds, giving him approximately 199 pounds of estimated lean mass if the body fat estimate is accurate. Applying moderate skepticism and including winners through 1953, the group average rises to 25.6, with the highest reaching 28.0. Across all analytical windows, the Silver Era champion average sits in the 24.9 to 25.6 range. The 2024 Gonzalez-Cano study provides the modern equivalent under testing conditions that didn't exist in 1948. WNBF Pro natural physique athletes at competition weight averaged a BMI of 25.52. Amateur competitors averaged 24.45. The tested FFMI peak cleared 25.73. At the peaks of each distribution, the gap narrows to roughly 0.33 points. The study's documented high of 25.73 against the pre-steroid era champion average of 25.4. Helms himself noted in 2014 that the pre-steroid era comparison carries a confounding factor. Bodybuilding in the 1940s and 1950s was a tiny sport, drawing from a small national talent pool. The researchers who compiled the historical analysis reasoned that a modest pool of competition winners from a niche sport couldn't establish the absolute ceiling of drug-free human potential. If the modern tested natural competition peak is drawing from a substantially larger talent pool than the pre-steroid era competition did, the expectation should be that modern peaks equal or exceed historical ones, not fall behind them. The fact that a modern tested natural is reaching 25.73 while the pre-steroid era average was 25.4 may represent convergence, not deficit. The averages diverge. The peaks overlap within measurement uncertainty. That's the most precise verdict the group comparison supports. The testosterone paradox. Now, the segment that changes the analytical frame for everything above, and the one that no commenter in the previous discussion had yet connected directly to this comparison. A 2007 paper by Travison and colleagues published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism documented what the authors called a substantial and as yet unrecognized age-independent population-level decrease in testosterone in American men. Tracking participants from the Massachusetts male aging study across 3 collection waves involving 1,374 men in the greater Boston area, they found something that the aging literature hadn't previously separated out. A 60-year-old man measured in 2004 had testosterone approximately 17% lower than a 60-year-old man measured in 1987. Same age bracket, different generation. The decline wasn't an artifact of the subjects getting older, it was happening across same age cohorts in different calendar years, which made it a generational effect, not a biological aging effect. Lokeshwar and colleagues published a complementary analysis using U.S. National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey data. 4,045 adolescent and young adult males aged 15 to 39. The precise demographic that does most of the serious resistance training in any era. Mean total testosterone in that group declined from 605.39 nanograms per deciliter in 1999 to 2000, down to 451.22 nanograms per deciliter in 2015 to 2016. A 25% reduction across 16 years. The researchers noted it was the first published work to document the decline specifically in young men, not just older populations. The absolute numbers are worth slowing down on. 605 nanograms per deciliter was the young male baseline at the turn of the millennium. By the mid-2000s, that same demographic measured 451 nanograms per deciliter. A young man who would have averaged 605 nanograms per deciliter when the study opened was replaced by a younger generation averaging 154 nanograms per deciliter less. Not because of aging, but because of something happening to baseline physiology across the population. A separate cohort study by Mazur and colleagues followed U.S. Air Force veterans longitudinally rather than cross-sectionally. Mean total testosterone fell from 638 nanograms per deciliter in 1982 to 431 nanograms per deciliter in 2002, a 207 nanograms per deciliter decline representing approximately 33% over 20 years. The expected decline from aging alone in the same individuals over 20 years would have been significantly smaller. The excess decline was real and exceeded what biology of aging predicts. Finnish researchers Perhentupa and colleagues confirmed the same pattern in a completely independent national population in 2012. More recently born Finnish men had systematically lower testosterone than their earlier born peers across multiple age cohorts. An independent Israeli cohort study covering 2006 to 2019 found testosterone drops exceeding 10% across nearly every age category over just 13 years. A systematic meta-analysis synthesizing 1,257 studies covering more than 1 million subjects found a persistent annual decline of approximately 0.56% per year in testosterone levels, remaining statistically significant after adjustment for both age and assay methodology. 4 independent national populations, American, Finnish, Israeli, in the combined dataset from the meta-analysis, 4 separate study designs, the same secular trend identified consistently across all of them. Now the critical caveat, stated plainly because this script has committed to being explicit about inference versus measurement. The available data only goes back to 1982 at the earliest point of systematic testosterone measurement in cohort studies. There are no clinical testosterone measurements from men training in the 1940s or 1960s. Stating a specific nanograms per deciliter figure for a 1947 bodybuilder would be fabrication. What the longitudinal data supports is an inference that if testosterone has been declining at roughly 0.5 to 1% per year since at least the late 1980s, and if that trend extends backward through decades where no measurement was collected, then men training in the silver era possessed substantially higher endogenous testosterone than men training today. The Lokeshwar data implies that a young man in 2000 averaged 605 nanograms per deciliter. The trajectory toward the 1940s, extrapolated backward, and this is explicitly an extrapolation, not a measurement, suggests silver-era men likely had baselines considerably higher still. A reasonable inference, drawing from the multi-decade secular trend data, places the gap between the silver-era baseline and the current young male average at somewhere above 200 nanograms per deciliter. This script calls that what it is, directional inference from demonstrated trend lines, not a measured historical fact. The confounding factors are real and documented by the researchers themselves. Travison's team stated explicitly that the testosterone decline does not appear to be attributable to observed changes in explanatory factors, meaning they couldn't fully account for it through the obvious candidates of increasing obesity rates, sedentary behavior, dietary pattern changes, or declining smoking rates. The Finnish cohort study is particularly informative here because Finland's population-level lifestyle shifts during the measurement window were substantially different from those in the United States, yet the same testosterone decline appeared in Finnish men. Researchers have identified endocrine-disrupting chemical exposure, PFOA compounds, organochlorines, phthalates, as candidate explanations. The cause remains genuinely uncertain. What isn't uncertain is the measurement. Testosterone levels fell across multiple independent populations, they fell in young men as well as older ones, and they fell at rates that can't be explained entirely by changes in known confounders. Here's what that means for the comparison. Grimek, Reeves, and Colbert weren't only working with good genetics and disciplined training protocols. By the inference the secular decline data supports, they were working with an endogenous hormonal baseline that modern men no longer naturally carry at the population level. If their testosterone was running 200 or more nanograms per deciliter above what the Lokeshwar study documents as the young male average in 2015 to 2016, which the secular trend implies directionally, even without a direct measurement, then some portion of their physique development had a biological tailwind that has since declined across the entire male population, independent of anything any individual athlete chose to do. The athletes in the 2024 WNBF study, competing under WADA testing, documented at FFMI values, including one at 25.73, were training and competing in the lower testosterone environment. The young male baseline Lokeshwar documents for their era is 451 nanograms per deciliter. By the Maser trajectory, the same young male in 1982 averaged 638 nanograms per deciliter. Extrapolate backward from there toward the 1940s, and the gap grows further still. Modern tested naturals are achieving FFMI values that overlap with the pre-steroid era champion average of 25.4, while operating at testosterone baselines that the longitudinal data suggests are substantially lower than what those pre-steroid era athletes naturally carried. The standard debate frame in these discussions runs in two directions. One side argues that silver-era physiques prove natural limits are achievable. The opposing side argues that silver-era men may have accessed testosterone anyway, invalidating the comparison. This video's third frame. Even if the silver-era men were fully natural, they were working with higher baseline testosterone than modern men carry by default. And modern tested naturals are still reaching the same measurement territory, not despite equal hormonal conditions, despite measurably lower ones. No commenter in the previous discussion had explicitly connected those two observations. The individual who raised declining testosterone picked up 30+ likes on that comment and correctly identified the phenomenon. But the analytical link, that if silver-era men had a hormonal baseline advantage and modern tested naturals are still matching their competition averages, that is evidence of achievability under worse conditions, not just comparable conditions, hadn't been drawn. This is where the numbers actually lead. The Maser data provides the starkest single illustration. 638 nanograms per deciliter in 1982, dropping to 431 nanograms per deciliter by 2002 in the same cohort of individuals across 20 years, exceeding what aging alone predicts. If 1982 was already in decline from the silver-era baseline, and the multi-population secular trend evidence strongly implies it was, the trajectory toward the 1940s suggests a gap that likely exceeded 200 nanograms per deciliter between what a silver-era athlete naturally carried and what a modern athlete carries as his default starting point. The men producing FFMI 25.73 under WADA testing are operating in that lower T world. They're still reaching the territory the silver-era champions defined. The verdict. The title asked who wins. The data answers it specifically. Silver-era wins on individual estimated FFMI peaks. Grimek's defensible central estimate of 26 to 28, Reeves's range of 25.8 to 26.8, and Colbert's derived estimate of 28.0 to 28.4 all sit above the 2024 WNBF tested competition peak of 25.73. That edge is real, but it rests on body fat assumptions derived from photographs taken under variable conditions, not from DEXA or hydrostatic weighing data. The gap between a silver-era individual peak and the modern tested competition high may reflect genuine physiological difference, or it may partly reflect measurement methodology differences across 70 years. The data doesn't resolve it cleanly. Silver-era wins on documented arm circumference at the specific figures available. Reeves's self-reported 18.5 to 19 inches cold, Colbert's documented 19 inches cold, and even Grimek's 17.5 inches cold all exceed what modern tested competition athletes typically report at stage weight. Alpha Destiny's documented 16 inches at his stated body weight represents a real gap against the silver-era arm figures, not a close match. Modern naturals win on verifiability. Every FFMI figure from the 2024 WNBF study comes with WADA certification attached to the competition results. The silver-era figures come with self-reports, magazine citations, and body fat estimates from photographs taken with equipment and conditions that varied by photographer and publication. The modern tested figures represent a higher epistemological standard, even if the resulting numbers are sometimes lower. Modern naturals win the group comparison that matters most for what the audience actually wants to know. The pre-steroid era champion average of 25.4 FFMI sits above the documented range for modern tested natural competition on average. That gap is real, but the peak of the modern tested natural distribution, 25.73, has cleared the pre-steroid era champion average.
The distributions aren't identical. They aren't separated by a gulf, and the testosterone paradox reorients what the gap means. The silver era athletes likely carried higher baseline testosterone than modern men. The modern tested athletes are reaching the same average territory under lower hormonal conditions. The gap between the averages may reflect the testosterone differential more than it reflects any insurmountable ceiling on natural muscular development. The payoff. The testosterone paradox doesn't just add context to this comparison. It changes what the comparison implies. If Grimek, Reeves, and Colbert were training with hormonal baselines that the secular decline data implies were substantially higher than what modern men carry, and modern WADA-tested naturals working at 451 nanograms per deciliter average baseline are still producing FFMI values that overlap with the pre-steroid era champion average, then the framing of silver era physiques as uniquely exceptional runs into a specific problem. The men who built those physiques may have had a hormonal tailwind baked in at the population level, independent of anything they chose to do. That doesn't diminish what they achieved. It changes what their achievements imply about achievability for everyone else. The physiques in question, the proportions, the FFMI range, the general scale that defined what observers in the 1940s called the ideal male form, sit within the documented range of what WADA-tested natural athletes achieve at the top of their current distribution. Not the average gym member, not someone 18 months into consistent training. The top of the tested natural distribution, competing at competition day conditioning, under a drug testing standard that would identify pharmaceutical assistance if it was present. Eric Helms asked the question in his 2014 Alan Aragon's Research Review article, "What can be achieved as a natural bodybuilder?" The 2024 WMBF data answers with a peer-reviewed measurement. FFMI above 25, under drug testing, on competition day. Corey's own data answered it in 1995 with the pre-steroid era average of 25.4. The ceiling the internet assigned from that study, a hard wall at 25.0, isn't what the study actually established. The ceiling the combined data supports is higher than 25, achievable under testing conditions, and currently being reached by modern athletes who carry less endogenous testosterone than the men those benchmarks were originally set against. The natty debate changes the history. It does not change what the numbers show is possible. Your training target, whatever version of silver era proportions you're working toward, isn't a relic from a higher testosterone age that modern men can only approximate. The data says men are reaching that territory. The data says they're doing it under testing conditions that make the achievement verifiable. And the data says they're doing it while carrying less baseline hormonal advantage than the men those targets were originally built around. The goal isn't dead. The question was never whether it could be done. The numbers just showed you it already has been. Subscribe for more stories like this.